Allow me to greet you with words from 2 John, verse 3, where it says, "Grace, mercy, and peace will be with us from God the Father and from Jesus Christ the Father's Son in truth and love." Good morning. Allow me to read to you a passage from Mark chapter 8 for your encouragement this morning. I'm going to start in Mark chapter 8, verse 22. It says, "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva in his eyes and laid hands on him, he asked him, 'Can you see anything?' And the man looked up and said, 'I can see people, but they look like trees walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again and looked intently and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. And then he sent him away to his home, saying, 'Do not even go into the village.' And Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they answered him, 'John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' And Peter answered him, 'You are the Messiah.' And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at the disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind, not on divine things, but on human things.' And he called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, 'If any of you want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. But those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of the Father with his holy angels.'" Well, may the Lord bless the reading of his word. This passage in Mark is one of the clearest examples, or the first examples that many people notice, of Mark taking stories, similar stories in the events of Jesus' life, and putting them together to help us in such a way to help us understand a bigger meaning, or what these different instances say together on a larger whole. And so you've got this at the middle part of chapter 8, this record of Jesus healing a blind man, but in stages. That's the only example of a two-stage healing in the Gospels, in the first 4 books of the New Testament. And then right along with that, you have this example of Peter giving this profession of faith, one of the clearest professions of faith thus far by the disciples, and so clear that Jesus warns him not to broadcast that loudly, lest the authorities hear it and arrest him before he's ready. Try to crucify him before he's finished his earthly ministry. You've got Peter seeing, but only partially, and so Jesus has to, just like the blind man, give a second touch, give a further instruction to Peter. And then, and in doing that, he says, you will have to take up your cross and follow me. You'll have to be willing to deny yourself, to deny specifically in this passage, your conceptions of what this faith is all about. You'll have to deny or be willing to have changed and updated and corrected your perceptions of what I'm about, Jesus would say, what Jesus' life and ministry is about. The perceptions, your assumptions, your claims about what following Jesus is all about. We know from other passages the disciples wanted a victorious Jesus, wanted him to kick the Romans out and restore the glory of Israel. They wanted him to affirm all their deepest held, desires and hopes, national, personal desires. But here, Jesus reveals a part of who he is, a very central part of who he is, that they didn't understand. And Jesus models for us wonderful behavior here in that he has the courage to share with those closest to him the full measure of who he is and give over to them the decision whether they reject him or not. We often have that same feeling in our churches and our communities and our families or so forth. Can we really share who we are with others and still have them accept us? Jesus models for us wonderful behavior here. He shares the full measure of his vocation, his calling, to be that suffering servant that Isaiah spoke of. It's not one of the most commonly embraced, quote unquote, Jewish notions of their Messiah. They much prefer a Messiah that wins all the victories and restores all the glory to that kind of role of the Messiah and also suffering. And so Jesus shares that role, and Peter doesn't like it. He loves the healings and the multiplication of bread and fishes. He loves the quieting of the storms and the driving out of demons. And he loves that Jesus is a new leader, but he doesn't like that he suffers. There's something about the suffering that Peter doesn't like. And so he actually rebukes Jesus. So it looks like, too, he's leveling a temptation to Jesus. And Jesus then, says, "Get behind me, Satan." He speaks to Peter as if when facing the temptations of the devil in the wilderness. One of the things about Scripture that I appreciate is how much it tells us about our human nature. I can tell you from history that one of the challenges in some of the places that I've lived, is when people try to avoid suffering, they can actually bring hell up to earth. I'm thinking of the late 1880s, 1890s period, when more and more farmers were going into foreclosure, losing their family farms in the kind of South, that Louisiana, Mississippi area. Their temptation was that they would go one of two ways. One, often they would form co-ops and form farmer groups, alliances to try to draw together in solidarity to resist going into foreclosure, or they would dress up as terrorists, white cappers, sometimes called bulldozers, and begin to take out their frustrations on African American farmers and also white landowners allied or renting to African American farmers. And so these groups called the White Cappers came through Southwest Mississippi, parts of Louisiana, like a scourge, committing hundreds of violent acts, killings, targeting law enforcement, targeting white landowners, targeting African-American landowners. These were disaffected white farmers who had lost their land, some, not all. And so this was a really tumultuous time, sometimes forming up into armed groups, marauding the country, and as many as 40, 50 strong. Again, one of the key challenges of this life is, how do we face suffering? And Jesus, again, shows us a great example, an example that will help us, help others around us, help others that we might take our suffering out on, into dealing with our fears, dealing with even the prospect of suffering with great courage. So Peter rejects Jesus at the notion that he would have to suffer. But then Jesus goes on to say, following me is about facing those fears. It's about facing even the prospect of suffering. Believing in a God who, even though our fellow humans can send us to the grave, God can raise us up. Even when Jesus, as our promised Messiah, doesn't meet some of our expectations or is different than we thought, God has the power to thank God, defy our expectations in a much bigger way. The role of Jesus as a suffering servant is how he would bring salvation to all people, the oppressed and the oppressors, the Jews and the Romans. Sometimes we think of this faith as the key parts of this faith is having all of our doctrines right or all of our practices right. We sometimes do so without even thinking about it. But Mark shows us that actually it's better for us to think of this faith like this healing. That our faith is more of us coming close to Jesus, seeking Jesus' presence, spending time in his words, and staying open to the second touch. Knowing that we're going to get things wrong. We might get things fundamentally wrong. We might get things so wrong that we're hijacking or kind of threatening to derail Jesus' own ministry. But we stay open that he has the power and the love to stay with us and offer us that second touch, to offer us that further instruction, to offer us that grace. It's not easy words that Jesus would say. You're going to have to deny yourself. You're going to have to face the cross. You're going to have the courage to suffer. It's not easy words, but they're true. Again, I find the human condition described here, and that we will often go to great lengths and even hurt those around us intentionally or unintentionally to avoid suffering. But Jesus gives us an example of having the courage, of the belief in God, that we can face whatever, our fears of rejection, fears of suffering, and God's goodness and graciousness and forgiveness can overwhelm all that. Well, I hope that you can read through Mark chapter 8, and maybe even this pattern of Mark putting these stories of Jesus together for you to give a bigger example might be an encouragement. I'll just say once more that all the places that Jesus leads us are worth going, even when it's the hard places of our own personal lives or our society. There's some that would like to kind of avoid kind of dealing with the hard stuff, but Jesus gives us a great example that we can have courage to do that. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace. To him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, to him be the glory and the honor and the power forever and ever. Amen. May you be blessed by your reading of Mark 8 today.